Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, April 29th, 2022, end of April for our live shows, because we head into the weekend now, of course. And April, being only 30 days long, well, there's just not room for any more of them. So this is it. Grab your last April show. Supplies limited. Act now. I guess I'm the one that needs to act now. You just sit there and enjoy yourself now. And I'll take care of all the acting. Oh, yes, right. Where's my, we have the, oh no, if I play the acting, shoo, I almost did it. Almost played the acting clip and realized just in time that would eliminate our pleasant, ethereal background music, which wouldn't take away from the show any, but is jarring and weird if it just goes missing all of a sudden. So we're not going to do it that way. Well, ready to roll out another show? No, not exactly. But the time has come, so we'll make the attempt anyway. The Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now. That's all we can do, you know. 9 o'clock has come and gone, so it's live now. Today we have bad news and good news. That's good. I mean, and bad, but I mean, you get the idea. The bad news, Kagro X throws fruit. That's true, and I'm pretty good at it too. And the good news, never in anger. That's right. I toss fruit because I love, I guess, is the message I'm taking away from this. And as a matter of fact, I only throw passion fruit. So fantastic, right? It works out very well. And depending on the phase in which I pick it and throw it at you, it could be more or less damaging. Passion fruit, ripe passion fruit, very strong smell. Smells terrific if you like the taste. Very strong, acidic smell and taste, but very light and difficult to aim properly as a result. Actually, I would say when you're talking about ripe passion fruit, if you have any idea what I'm talking about, get your own radio show and tell people about it there. That could be a whole different subject. The relative throwing weights of different fruits. And, well, gee whiz. I don't know. Those passion fruits sort of, they ripen, they dry up almost, and they have a very wiffle ball quality about them, I bet, when you throw them. And they curve very hard, depending on what kind of brake you put on it. So, all right. Now that you know that, you might opt for attempting to throw bananas like boomerangs, or pick your own favorite fruit. I would guess that apples and oranges probably are the best, although I don't like to compare apples and oranges, but I do like to throw both, and comparatively speaking, I think as between these two fruit, probably among the best in terms of your ability to aim and control the toss. Something like that. It's very, compact, evenly distributed weight, very ball-like in every respect. So maybe that's what the show could be the next couple of months, evaluating different fruits. And then at the end, I tear my, what would I tear? Rotator cuff, throwing a watermelon. So, all right. Goodness, and probably the only person podcasting currently who needed Tommy John surgery in order to continue his fruit-throwing career. So, you can take that to the bank. They will kick you out, but, whatever. At any rate, the point is there's plenty to talk about today, including this breaking news. It's not really breaking news, but it just came to me via Twitter. I thought this was an interesting announcement from Michael Beschloss, who notes for us, for the record, NBC News presidential historian is how he identifies. Everyone's got pronouns, and historian is his. Nixon announced tonight. That would be, I guess, tonight, coming up. We didn't miss it yet. It wasn't last night. It was tweeted just 16 minutes ago. Nixon announced tonight in 1974 that he would issue what turned out to be inaccurate transcripts of some of his tapes. The phrase, this is the part I enjoyed about it, the phrase expletive deleted was about to enter our language. Very interesting. So, I don't know. I felt that was somehow appropriate to the show and appropriate to our view of history. and I'm glad to be able to share it with you. Let me put that away in Pocket so that you can have your very own look at what the hell's going on here with this. Oops, wait a second. This would not actually be the time, I think, to install a new OS system on the laptop. That would be bad. Let's try and save that for later. I've been avoiding installing for Macintosh people OS, what up to Monterey for some time now. No particular reason. It just seems like a good thing to delay. It's a pain in the neck every time you do something like this. All right, let's see. Most of my other tabs aren't open yet today for some reason. But let me open up the email and see how we're doing. Oh, look. If I had opened it earlier yesterday evening, I would have had this fantastic, I'm sure, contribution from Darwin, which I could, I suppose, play unedited, but I like to, clean everything up so that everybody who makes a submission sounds as together and professional as possible. So perhaps we'll save it for another day. Too bad though. If I had seen that, it wasn't like super late either. So thanks, Darwin. Appreciate it. 9:22 p.m. submission yesterday, but I was distracted and my head was elsewhere. So, all right, let's see. I did want to check in on the coronavirus tracking thing, because I think I'm about to go get coronavirus this weekend, as I've been invited to something that probably was unwise in terms of, not when it was planned, but now. Steady creep upward in the Loudoun County incidence of reported cases anyway, though it's still not, anything like Omicron spike levels. It's just a steady increase, probably about doubled the daily rates since I started getting worried about this stuff spiking back up again. But it's definitely not spike shaped. It's just a slow creep upward, and I guess that's part of what we'll be living with for the foreseeable future. Okay, let's see. I need to also open up Pocket and get rid of this here, and we'll open up a nice Twitter page and take a look through the Twitter feed for a couple of other things that I'm sure I forgot to put aside for you. I thought I might today, though, turn back around and make another attempt at reading through the Judge Ludwig op-ed on the weird Republican legal theory, the independent legislature theory. Even though we got through a good part of it the other day, I think it's a kind of a dense piece, and I thought maybe we would do best with a refresher just by actually reading the whole thing over again, even though we'd been over part of it. So first of all, I guess I have to be sure I can actually identify the thing and find it. But I also have a couple other longer essays that might make good sense to share alongside these things. All right, well, let's see. For whatever reason, it's not immediately obvious where I parked this thing. That's not so good. Why is this difficult to find? Along with the very long ProPublica piece that we probably will never get through either. Here it is. I think this is it here, the CNN. There we go. Opinion piece again from J. Michael Ludwig, former circuit court appellate judge and a staunch conservative in his own right. This was the Republican blueprint to steal the 2024 election. Perhaps we can jump around a little bit up top and breeze through the recap of how this article sets up and then get to the substance of how he takes apart the argument. But remember, the setup here is nearly a year and a half later, surprisingly few, he says, understand what January 6th was all about. I always hate that setup, but there it is. He's decided to use it. And by the way, oh yes, nice backgrounder up at the top, the editor's note. Ludwig was appointed by George H.W. Bush and served on the Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit for 15 years and advised Mike Pence on his role on January 6th as well. So again, He's sure that most people don't understand what January 6th was all about. And I would imagine that most people probably don't view it the same way that he does or have the depth of understanding of what happened. That's true. But I think we're in pretty good shape here on this show. Fewer still understand why former President Donald Trump and Republicans persist in their long disproven claim that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, much less why they are obsessed about making the 2024 race a referendum on the stolen election, quote-unquote stolen election of 2020, which even they know was not stolen. January 6th was never about a stolen election or even about actual voting fraud. It was always and only about an election that Trump lost, fair and square, under legislatively promulgated election rules in a handful of swing states that he and other Republicans contend were unlawfully changed by state election officials and state courts to expand the right and opportunity to vote, largely in response to the COVID pandemic. And right up front, it looks like he's paving the path of where he's going, reminding us just simply by stating it here, but I think by clearing it up a little bit later on, that these are or ought to be considered legislatively promulgated election rules. The Republican argument is that they were not, that they were, and in fact they were promulgated, I suppose, by non-legislative state personnel, but they are people to whom the legislature has, in most cases in the past, legislatively delegated the task of promulgating the small details or the smaller scale details of how the elections will be administered. And that's entirely permissible. And Republicans just hope you'll forget that part. The Republicans' mystifying claim to this day that Trump did or would have received more votes than Joe Biden in 2020 were it not for actual voting fraud is but the shiny object that Republicans have tauntingly and disingenuously dangled before the American public for almost a year and a half now to distract attention from their far more ambitious objective. That objective is not somehow to rescind the 2020 election as they would have us believe. That's constitutionally impossible. Not that they won't actually try it anyway, but it's true that it's supposed to be impossible, but so is taking emoluments, as I've said before. Trump and the Republicans' far more ambitious objective is to execute successfully in 2024 the very same plan they failed in executing in 2020 and to overturn the 2024 election if Trump or his anointed successor loses again in the next quadrennial contest. The last presidential election was a dry run for the next. From long before Election Day 2020, Trump and Republicans planned to overturn the presidential election by exploiting the electors and elections clauses of the Constitution, the Electoral College, the Electoral Count Act of 1877, and the 12th Amendment, if Trump lost the popular and Electoral College vote. The cornerstone of the plan was to have the Supreme Court embrace the little-known independent state legislature doctrine, which in turn would pave the way for exploitation of the Electoral College process and the Electoral Count Act, and finally for Vice President Mike Pence to reject enough swing state electoral votes to overturn the election using Pence's ceremonial power under the 12th Amendment and award the presidency to Donald Trump. The independent state legislature doctrine says, and so far I haven't done a great job skipping around, I'm just reading it straight, but I find it necessary. The independent state legislature doctrine says that under the elections and the electors clauses of the Constitution, state legislatures possess plenary and exclusive power over the conduct of federal presidential elections and the selection of state presidential electors. Not even a state Supreme Court, let alone other state elections officials, can alter the legislatively written election rules or interfere with the appointment of state electors by the legislatures under this theory. The Supreme Court has never decided whether to embrace the independent state legislature doctrine, but then Chief Justice William Rehnquist, going too far back there, William Rehnquist, and Justices Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, in separate concurring opinions, said they would embrace that doctrine in Bush v. Gore 20 years earlier, and Republicans had every reason to believe that there were at least 5 votes on the Supreme Court for the doctrine in November of 2020, with Amy Coney Barrett having been snuck in, as he says, in the 11th hour before the election. Trump and the Republicans began executing the first stage of their plan months before November 3rd by challenging, as violative of the independent state legislature doctrine, election rules relating to early and late voting. extensions of voting days and times, mail-in ballots, and other election law changes that Republicans contended, and in many places Republicans passed, that Republicans contended had been unlawfully altered by state officials and state courts in swing states such as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Michigan. These cases eventually wound their way to the Supreme Court in the fall of 2020, and by December, the Supreme Court had decided all of these cases, but only by orders, either disallowing federal court intervention to change an election rule that had been promulgated by a state legislature, allowing legislatively promulgated rules to be changed by state officials and state courts, or deadlocking 4-4 because Justice Barrett was not sworn in until after those cases were briefed and ready for decision by the court. In none of these cases did the Supreme Court decide the all-important independent state legislature doctrine. Thwarted by the Supreme Court's indecision on that doctrine, Trump and the Republicans turned their efforts to the second stage of the plan, exploitation of the Electoral College and the Electoral Count Act. The Electoral College, of course, is the process by which Americans choose their presidents, a process that can lead to the election as president of a candidate who does not receive a majority of the votes cast by the American voters. Republicans have grown increasingly wary of the Electoral College, have they? With the new census and political demographics of the nation's shifting population. The Electoral Count Act empowers Congress to decide the presidency in a host of circumstances where Congress determines that state electoral votes were not, quote, regularly given by electors who were, quote, lawfully certified. Terms that are unidentified and ambiguous. That's one of the problems. And this second stage of the plan, the Republicans needed to generate state-certified alternative slates of electors from swing states where Biden won the popular vote, who would cast their electoral votes for Trump instead. That's what they were aiming for. How do they get it? Congress would then count the votes of these alternative electoral slates on January 6th rather than the votes of the certified electoral slates for Biden, and Trump would be declared the reelected president. And I guess in the first instance here, the plan is simply to generate those things and put it to Vice President Pence to say, they're real. Read them and add it up, and for the tellers to say, okay, yes, we'll do that, even though two of the tellers will be Democrats. But I guess the plan is to outvote them on the question of whether or not that's what should be counted, and then go from there. Just simply everybody agree to the lie that these are the real slates that we're going to count. And you could do it that way, just a frontal assault. I mean, there's very little that stands in the way if you get enough votes behind it. So, the Republicans' plan failed at this stage when they were unable to secure a single legitimate alternative slate of electors from any state because the various state officials refused to officially certify these Trump-urged slates. Thwarted by the Supreme Court in the first stage and foiled by their inability to come up with alternative state electoral slates in the second stage, and with time running out, Trump and the Republicans began executing the final option of their plan, which was to scare up illegitimate alternative electoral slates in swing states to be transmitted to Congress. So I guess the difference here, and I don't think he's done a great job so far in illustrating exactly what they mean, is the plan B, or the second stage here, was to get state legislatures legitimately to sit down and decide for themselves, yes, we will pass some sort of a resolution officially rescinding our, what were supposed to be our official electoral slates, and we substitute these instead, and we do so under the signature, under the imprimatur of the state legislature. They couldn't get any state legislatures to reconvene and agree to do that, so they went about the process of getting people who, in some cases, who stood for election as electors and lost in those states, and in some other cases, just some Republican activists who were willing to say they would stand as fake electors just for the purposes of signing a document that could get sent, and then bring them together and under their own auspices, under no official color of law, get together and sign certificates as though they had actually been elected, when indeed they had not, nor had they been appointed by the state legislatures. They were just going to send those documents anyway, and they did. Whereupon, that's what the plan was, for them to arrive, and on January 6th, Vice President Pence would count only the votes of the illegitimate electors from the swing states and not the votes of the legitimate certified electors that were cast for Biden, and then just declare Trump's re-election as president of the United States. The entire house of cards collapsed at noon on January 6th when Pence refused to go along with the ill-conceived plan, correctly concluding that under the 12th Amendment he had no power to reject the votes that had been cast by the duly certified electors or to delay the count to give Republicans even more time to whip up alternative electoral slates. They still were hoping for that at that point. If we can just delay the count and get Pence to say, let's ask the states one more time and give them 10 days to convene and do it officially, what the activists in those states have done unofficially, and see if anybody takes the bait. And then we'll get back, and if anybody does take the bait, we'll count the second slate. But Pence wouldn't go along. Pence declared Joe Biden the 46th president of the United States at 3:40 a.m. on Thursday, January 7th, roughly 14 hours after rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol, disrupting the joint session and preventing Congress from counting the Electoral College votes for president until late that night and into the following day after the statutorily designated day for counting those votes. Trump and his allies and supporters in Congress and the states began readying their failed 2020 plan to overturn the 2024 presidential election later that very same day. And they have been unabashedly readying that plan ever since, in plain view to the American public. Today, they are already a long way toward recapturing the White House in 2024, whether Trump or another Republican candidate wins the election or not. Trump and Republicans are preparing to return to the Supreme Court, where this time they will likely win the independent state legislature doctrine, now that Amy Coney Barrett is on the court and ready to vote. Barrett has not addressed the issue, but this turns on an originalist interpretation of the Constitution, and Barrett is firmly aligned on that method of constitutional interpretation with Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch, all three of whom have written that they believe the doctrine is correct. And remember, the doctrine here is only that the state legislatures retain the power to determine how electors for their states will be selected. I think we all agree that they can do that. The only question is when and under what circumstances can they change their minds. Only last month, in a case from North Carolina, the court declined to hear Moore versus Harper. 4 justices, Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, said that the independent state legislature question is of exceptional importance to our national elections. The issue will continue to recur, and the court should decide the issue sooner rather than later before the next presidential election. This case involved congressional redistricting, but the independent state legislature doctrine is as applicable to redistricting as it is to presidential elections. The Republicans are also in the throes of electing Trump-endorsed candidates to state legislative offices in key swing states, installing into office their favored state election officials who deny that Biden won the 2020 election, such as secretaries of state, electing sympathetic court judges onto the state benches, and grooming their preferred potential electors for ultimate selection by the party so they will be positioned to generate and transmit alternative electoral slates to Congress if need be. Finally, they are furiously politicking to elect Trump supporters to the Senate and House so they can overturn the election in Congress as a last resort. Forewarned is to be forearmed. Trump and the Republicans can only be stopped from stealing the 2024 election at this point if the Supreme Court rejects the independent state legislature doctrine, thus allowing state court enforcement of state constitutional limitations on legislatively enacted election rules and elector appointments. And Congress amends the Electoral Count Act to constrain Congress's own power to reject state electoral votes and decide the presidency. Although the vice president will be a Democrat in 2024, both parties also need to enact federal legislation that expressly limits the vice president's power to be coextensive with the power accorded the vice president in the 12th Amendment and confirm that is largely ceremonial, as Pence construed it to be on January 6th. With Ludwig's help, Vice President Kamala Harris would preside over the joint session in 2024, or I guess 2025. Neither Democrats nor Republicans have any idea who will be presiding after that, however. Thus, both parties have the incentive to clarify the vice president's ceremonial role now. As it stands today, Trump or his anointed successor and the Republicans are poised, in their word, to steal, their word, from Democrats the presidential election in 2024 that they falsely claim the Democrats stole from them in 2020. But there is a difference between the falsely claimed stolen election of 2020 and what would be the stolen election of 2024. Unlike the Democrats' theft claimed by Republicans, the Republicans' theft would be in open defiance of the popular vote, and thus the will of the American people. Poetic, though tragic, irony for America's democracy. And that's it. We made it all the way through, and just in time, too, because it's time for our first 2-minute break. And he didn't dive quite as deeply into undermining the theory as I thought that he might. But the larger point, I think, that he makes still stands, which is that in 2020, the Republican legislatures were new to the theory and, of course, out of session in most cases, and thought that it would take extraordinary measures to get them back together, and they weren't at all sure that they could get majority support for just withdrawing the old electors, the real ones, and substituting fake ones.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Edwards Radio. The break cut into the little riff at the end there, but essentially what I get from the Ludwig article is the reminder that the only thing that stood in the way of Republicans pulling off the second phase, the Plan B of their scheme to reverse the election, was that Republican state legislators, were not yet convinced that they had the legal authority to convene and withdraw the officially submitted slates of electors and use their plenary power to appoint electors instead, even though they had had an election and lost it, and appoint them instead and substitute them for the original that got sent under, proper auspices. And it's still highly questionable, but again, it comes down to something we've discussed this point not all that far back in the past, a week or two ago, that essentially the question is, not whether or not the states have the right to have their legislatures decide how electors will be appointed. We have to grant that. That's pretty clear facially. It's just that for the last however many years, decades, 100 years or whatever it's been, maybe more, the methodology has been we'll have elections on election day in the state, and whoever wins the popular vote in our state within our boundaries will win the electoral votes. And some states have tinkered with it, right? They've said, some states say it's winner take all. The winner of the election in the state wins all of our electoral votes. Some states divide it. Sometimes, I think when it's divided, it's usually divided by congressional district. And if you win one congressional district, if within the boundaries of that congressional district, if you win the popular vote, you win that district's electoral vote. And if it happens the other way, it's usually in states that only have a relatively small number, usually 3 of the electoral votes, and they'll split it up differently. So the overall state winner gets 1 or 2 sometimes. I guess in a state that has 3 electoral votes, well, no, I guess it would have to be among states that have at least 4, because if you have 3, there's no division of the state into House districts. You have to have at least 4 electoral votes in order to have that take effect. So they might say, or remember how electoral votes are assigned. And not everybody remembers this offhand, but it's the number of representatives, small r, the number of people representing you or eligible seats for representing you anyway. Sometimes there's vacancies in Congress. So if you're a small population state, Wyoming, or a small population and small geographic state, Vermont, and you have the bare minimum, that is to say, not enough people to qualify for a second House seat. You've got 2 Senate seats, as every state does, plus 1 one House seat as an at-large representative for your entire state. All 3 of them are elected statewide, of course, but 2 of them to 6-year terms and 1 of them to 2-year terms, and it's weird, and it feels funny for states that have larger populations, but that's the way it is, and that's how you'll have 3 electoral votes, and that's the minimum number for anyone to have. And of course, if you were to adopt a rule, maybe some states occasionally have had 2 seats and they lose population, and in reapportionment they only end up with 1 seat, so they might still have it on the books, something that says we allocate our electoral votes by congressional district. When you have 2 of them, you can do it. The statewide winner of the vote will get the electoral votes that correspond to those members of Congress who have been elected statewide, the 2 senators. Or in the case of a small state with only 1 member of the House, all 3, because all 3 are elected statewide. Otherwise, though, if you have at least 4, the statewide winner would get the 2 electoral votes that correspond to the 2 Senate seats, and you could opt to then take a closer look to how the vote broke down statewide and count by congressional district. And if in congressional district 1, candidate A gets the majority of the votes, candidate A gets that 1 electoral college vote that goes along with it. And if district 2 goes for candidate B, that single electoral vote goes to candidate B. So you get the idea. If candidate B won statewide, 3 electoral votes for candidate B, 1 electoral vote for candidate A. So, there's no doubt that the legislature has the ability to change the way they're distributed or choose the way that they're distributed in the first instance, either winner take all or split it up by congressional district. Or I guess they could decide to split it up some other way. It's just that no other way that makes any particular sense has ever as far as I know, has ever presented itself and been accepted by a state legislature. But you could, I guess, conceivably divide it up somehow by some other way, just so long as you don't exceed the number of electoral votes that you have. And I don't know, I've never seen anybody challenge the idea that electoral votes have to remain whole. I suppose you could, I don't know, what's the theory? Could you name twice as many electors and give each one a half vote? I guess. I don't know. I'd really have to read the electors' clauses of the Constitution more closely again, and then any statutes that might relate to it. But anyway, the idea is you certainly can't give yourself more electoral votes in total. But at any rate, as we've discussed at length before on the program, the option is there to say we're not going to have an election at all. The rest of you on election day will have elections in your states, but in our state, the state legislature will get together, and whichever candidate they favor as a majority in the state legislature, by act of the state legislature, they will name their own electors. I will, we here in the legislature support, candidate B, just to take names off of it, for whatever reason, probably party affiliation, and we therefore choose to select as our electors for the state this slate suggested for us, most often, by candidate B, him or herself, and we, by act of the legislature, designate them to be our electoral college representatives, and that's that. And we won't hold the election. That's a power that the state legislatures definitely do have. The open question is, how soon do they have to exercise that, and is that an option that's available to them if they at first decide, like every other state, to have an election and then decide for whatever reason that the results of the election are not to their satisfaction, either simply because they lost or because they believe there was something wrong with the election, or convince themselves that they believe that something was wrong with the election in order to give themselves a premise for questioning the validity of that outcome. And that would then trigger them to say, well, if the Constitution gives us the power to be able to decide who our electors will be and how they will be appointed, how they'll be selected, that power doesn't disappear, in our opinion, just because we've decided it once. We would like a second bite at the apple. We decided in January of last year that we would continue the 200-year tradition of having an election to determine who the electors will be from this state. But then in November of this year, we had that election, and for some reason we disagree with the validity, or claim to disagree with the validity of the results of that election, and instead we changed our minds. Most people think that we have to make this choice once and then abide by it, but actually nothing in the rules anywhere necessarily says that that's the case. And although it seems unfair to tell everybody we're going to rely on an election and then have the election and then decide, especially for specious reasons, that we don't like the outcome of the election, and then change our minds and say, that was all a futile exercise. I don't know why we spent all the money to put all those voting machines out there and have people administer them and count the votes. We meant to appoint our electors directly. After all, we just were momentarily, like for the last year and a half, distracted from that goal by falsely believing that we trusted the idea of having an election. So, the question is there a deadline, essentially, is what it comes down to. Is there a date after which the decision, whatever it is, to go with an election or appointment by the legislature or coin toss or lot drawing, if anybody even does that anymore, or best 2 out of 3 in, one-on-one basketball. I don't know, anything. Could be anything you want. But once that decision is made, do you have to stick with it? And is there a drop-dead date? And can anybody figure out what it is, if there is one, before which the legislature has to make any changes, and after which the original plan is simply locked in? And I guess you could think about all sorts of hypothetical scenarios to try and come up with a way or a scenario in which it might be permissible to change things after the fact, even late in the game. Like, what if, for instance, and this is what they're relying on, what if you, make the traditional decision, we're going to have an election in this state, whatever state it may be, in Ohio. We're going to have an election, and that's going to determine who the electors from Ohio are going to be. And then you go to hold the election, and let's say you actually do hold the election, and then let's say there actually is something that happens. What if, I don't know, we'll try and make it a no-fault sort of thing. You have the election, and then everybody gathers up all the votes from the machines and ballot boxes, however you want to do it, and centralizes them all in the counting warehouse there, and everybody starts counting the vote. And I know they do it distributed, but whatever. They decide in Ohio, for whatever reason, we're going to ship all the ballots to Columbus or, any city they choose. They're going to Akron. Let's all do it in Akron. Let's all do it in, I don't know, give me another, Dresden, New Dresden, Ohio, and put all the votes in the Longaberger baskets. Isn't that where they are? Anyway. You could do all of that, and you get to counting it. But then tragedy strikes as lightning strikes and lights the basket on fire and destroys all the ballots before you got to count them. Now, all the ballots have been, through no fault of our own, destroyed. What are we going to do? I mean, that could happen. It's not likely, but it could happen. And what would you do? And would it be illegitimate at that point for a state legislature to say, well, we have to be represented in the Electoral College. There's no question about that. Or, I mean, there is. You could just not show up, and then they would decide what to do about that if nobody was able to capture a majority without the electoral votes of Ohio on the table. But, there's every possibility that a state like that could be the deciding factor. And it wasn't even as though things were rigged, unless you could somehow prove that somebody, I don't know, they put a lightning rod in the basket and took it outside during a known, thunderstorm threat, whatever it is. But perhaps through no fault of anyone in particular, the votes and the recording of the votes are destroyed somehow. And hypothetical state of Ohio here needs to be represented in the Electoral College. At that point, could the legislature convene in an emergency session and say, given the fact is that the ballots were destroyed and that we need to, the people of Ohio want to be represented in the counting of the Electoral College, and we don't know the outcome of the vote, but we're the duly elected representatives of the people of Ohio in the legislature, and no one disputes that. As a last resort, could we appoint a slate of electors, not knowing the outcome of the election? And perhaps that might even strike people as somehow more fair. But I don't know. I mean, if all the polling, for instance, had showed that candidate A was likely to win in Ohio the whole time, and you believe in polling, but the legislature is held and controlled by members of the party of candidate B, and they decided, well, if it's up to us, I prefer candidate B. After all, he's a member of my party, so we'll just cast the votes that way, even though all indications were, from the polling that was as scientific as you can get it, were that candidate A was going to run away with it. Would that be legitimate? And I guess, there I'd have a hard time with that one if I'm trying to be fair. Of course, why to be fair, I think we should, knock them all over the head and substitute a totally different legislature for them. But, I don't have any grounds for it, but that's how I would feel about it. But there, I guess, would be a hypothetical situation wherein a state legislature opts for an election. The election is held, and then the state legislature decides, there's good reasons for it in this case, but they decide that they're just simply going to substitute their judgment for the judgment of the people in the open vote. But, then again, at least at that point, you would say, well, I can't be sure that you're not making the same selection that they are. But when it's obvious that you're not, or when it's obvious that there's a result and it's clear and you can't demonstrate any really good reason why you should be able to override them, the Republican version of the independent state legislature doctrine still claims that the legislature could meet and say, we have heard the people of the state and we don't care. It could be as strong as that. We've heard, and there's no problem alleged with the counting or collection of the vote at all. We just don't like the outcome. Could you change it then? That's the other extreme. In between are the shades of gray. We claim to believe that the vote had been somehow corrupted. We claim to believe that the count had become somehow corrupted, whatever it is, whether it's voting machine theories about things, Hugo Chavez changing votes using smart thermostats and Italian satellites, or something more plain and obvious, or there was a documented and agreed upon malfunction of the counting in some way, or only people in my party are able to see the malfunction somehow, whatever it is. The question is, where does a state legislature's plenary power, if anywhere, end? And at what point, what's the extent of the power that they can exercise, and how late can they exercise it, is the question. And if it comes down to it, and only one or two states need to have that decided, would 5 justices of the Supreme Court act as partisan actors or real judges or what? We don't know. I guess what was going on, of course, in 2020, the problem that they had there was that they hadn't yet convinced any state legislatures that this was okay. Now that I've done it and convinced them that it's okay, they might do it in 2024. And all indications are, from listening closely to the call between Trump and Brad Raffensperger and other Republican officials, all indications are that with enough time to think about it and enough convincing that it was within their rights, Republicans would, in fact, have done Trump these favors and generated electoral college certificates for electors in his favor if they felt that current law opened the door for it. And they hadn't yet been convinced that that was the case, and now they are. Sometimes it has required a change in the law. Sometimes it has just required a change in the thinking, but they needed more time to change either the law or the thinking, and now they've got it. The time between 2020 and 2024 is being spent doing just that, reminding them that they do have this power, and they also have that power regardless of whether or not their belief in the need for a substitution of the legislature's judgment for the election's judgment is based on anything. It doesn't have to be, and it doesn't have to be real. It just has to be something you're willing to put your name to. That's the big problem. So we've teased it out of the Ludwig piece here eventually, and I think explained it correctly. And I think you knew going in that this was a relatively dangerous doctrine, and now I think you have a better idea, I hope, of just how dangerous it can be. That eventually you can just decide to do the opposite of what logic and all the evidence tell you. This came up again yesterday, in my mind anyway, and I didn't share it with you yesterday. But let's see, did I put it aside? Somebody was once again going on about the possibility of electing Trump as Speaker of the House. As Matt Gaetz has said he was going to do, said he was going to nominate Trump for Speaker if, I guess whether or not, Republicans won the House control of the House of Representatives in the next election. Of course, if they don't win control, he'll probably still do it, but just symbolically, knowing that it won't come to anything, but he'll have demonstrated his loyalty to Trump. And I guess he thinks he'll get a large sum of money or lots of power from that somehow, or just piss people off and enjoy the publicity from that. But if they do win control, then it's a serious question. if only because, they can seriously screw things up. But I know we've covered on the show before the things that you could do to screw around, to sow chaos in the United States as a saboteur Speaker of the House. But it all came up again yesterday, and not everybody has been convinced yet at this point. And I saw people tweeting yesterday that once again, Trump would never take the job either because he would consider it a step backward from the presidency, which he would, no doubt, because it is. Or that he would say, Trump would never be able to do or willing to do all the work that it takes to be Speaker of the House. But I remind everybody that, you don't have to do the work. You only have to do the work of being Speaker of the House if you want the country to function. And, the assumption to this point has been that most people do, want the country to function. But Trump doesn't necessarily. It doesn't bother him whether the country functions or not. It's better. It's more fun, more chaotic if it doesn't. So I just remind everybody of the things that you could do, the chaos you could sow if you were a Speaker of the House that didn't care about the House or the country or anything. What about all the bills? Does everybody remember that every bill that gets passed that's supposed to make its way to the president for signature because it's passed both houses in identical form goes through the Speaker's office? We don't always have the Speaker handle it because, again, usually the Speaker who wants the country to work correctly can appoint, if necessary, a Speaker pro tem and say, it's your job to sign enrolled bills. Remember that has to happen. Both houses pass the thing, and then they go to the Speaker of the House. And I don't even know who signs for the Senate. I guess whether the majority leader signs the things or the Secretary of the Senate signs the things, because the Speaker of the House is a constitutional officer, and the majority leader, floor leader of the Senate is not. But I know this much. During the enrollment process, the Speaker of the House or an appointed Speaker pro tem, some representative of the Speaker, has to sign the bill and dispatch it to the White House. What happens if the Speaker of the House refuses to sign and refuses to appoint a Speaker pro tem to do it in his stead because he wants to screw things up and wants to create chaos? Is it clear that there's a path to taking an enrolled bill that isn't signed by the Speaker or Speaker pro tem to the President, and by his signing it, created into law? And I'm not sure, because it could be construed by, a court, even acting non-maliciously. A court could say, the presentment clause tells us that it has to be presented to the president in a certain way. And although there's no mention of the enrollment process and signature by the Speaker of the House, I don't believe, in the Constitution, current practice is that the Speaker's signature stands for authentication of the document. And if the document hasn't been properly authenticated, is it law when the president signs it? I don't know. We don't know the answer because nobody's ever been crazy enough to test that. So you could certainly do that. Smaller pieces of mischief that you could get yourself involved with. Of course, remember that it is the Speaker of the House who decides on a date and convenes, with the concurrence of the Senate, convenes a joint session for receiving the State of the Union address. And there's an invitation issued by the Speaker of the House to deliver the address before a joint session of Congress in the House's chamber. If you refuse to, if you just don't bother issuing the invitation, what happens? Now, the president, of course, is still compelled at some level by the Constitution to deliver some sort of message on the State of the Union from time to time. It doesn't have to be annual necessarily. It doesn't have to be the same time of year each year. It doesn't say any of that. It doesn't have to be delivered orally. It can be written. The first couple presidents did deliver their State of the Union messages that way. It certainly doesn't have to be in a joint session of Congress or in the House chamber either. But traditionally it is, and it's a big symbol of power, and presidents and their campaign teams, by extension, even though you're not supposed to use footage from it, everybody covets the TV shot or the image going out to the country of the president standing at the rostrum, at the speaker's rostrum, with the flag behind him and the constitutional officers behind him and the Congress arrayed before him and the cheering and all the pageantry that goes with it. Could you deprive the president of it? Yes, absolutely, in a heartbeat, and I assume that Trump probably would. So there's plenty of mischief that he can make from that position, and that'd be the only interest he probably would have in the position, plus the fact that it would, would go into history books and F everybody up. So he's big enough into that, I think, that he might be convinced that that's a great way to do it. Also, by the way, somebody else threw out the possibility that they might become convinced that he could avoid legal proceedings against him if he were sitting as Speaker of the House. And it's not entirely clear that that's the case in what sense? Well, we all have gotten used to the idea that, for instance, there are at least OLC opinions that say that a sitting president can't be charged with a crime. It doesn't say anything, I'm sure, in the memo. I'm not positive, actually. No, I haven't read the thing lately, but I presume that it was written with the president in mind, and that there's no mention of other constitutional officers being afforded this privilege along with the president. But the argument would be the same, that the president is a constitutional officer responsible for all sorts of things, and that the distraction of criminal prosecution would be damaging for the country in general, national security, et cetera, et cetera. Less of an argument for the vice president, though it's clearly contemplated that these duties might fall at a moment's notice to the vice president. Not so much then for the Speaker of the House, who's next in line, depending on how you count things, second or third in line. If the first in line is the president, then they're already doing the job. But next in line after the vice president, of course, would be Speaker of the House. But by the same token, although it would seem to defy the odds, again, certainly in the same moment, the same momentary twist of fate could put the Speaker of the House in the same position with all the same responsibilities and national security implications. So we don't know for sure how a court would decide. And of course, that's the opportunity that he'd be looking for. Donald Trump could absolutely make this claim and then litigate it and force us to litigate it. And it could take years before we find out whether or not a sitting Speaker of the House, even one who doesn't want the job and won't do it, would be entitled to protection from criminal charge while in office. Okay, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Scaring the crap out of you yet? All right. Well, if not, I don't know. How about this? Would you like some more odd constitutional theorizing? There's another article that doesn't take us that far from the same scenario. The New York Times ran it the other day, April 20th, the guest opinion essay of Josh Blackman and S.B. Tillman, both professors of law. Blackman, a constitutional law professor at South Texas College of Law, Houston. Tillman, an associate professor at Maynooth, I don't think I know, Maynooth, M-A-Y-N-O-O-T-H, Maynooth University School of Law and Criminology. School of Law and Criminology, that's interesting. I don't know where, I don't know to look that one up. I am learning a lot about universities these days. But let's see. Oh, look at that. The National, I did not know this. It's a prominent institution, but not in this country, unless you're listening in Ireland, in which case it is in your country. University of Maynooth, the National University of Ireland at Maynooth, commonly known as Maynooth University. Are they? I don't know whether they're all national universities in Ireland or whatever, but okay, a constituent university of the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, County Kildare, Ireland. So there you have it, a major educational institution in Ireland, and that at least explains why I don't know anything about it. Been to Ireland, nice place, didn't go to college there. Was in college while I was there, but just not in Ireland. Anyway, so Blackman and Tillman get together and offer this piece up. Only the feds could disqualify Madison Cawthorn and Marjorie Trader Greene. She illustrates the piece here, as she's the one most recently in trouble on this count. Madison Cawthorn, of course, most recently in trouble on every count. And perhaps we can peek in on what he's in trouble on lately. But this is an interesting theory, and some counterpoints made to it by Lawrence Tribe, who tweets about the piece after its publication. The events of January 6, 2021, they say, are casting a long shadow over midterm elections. I don't know whether Tillman is Irish himself, but he does teach in Ireland, and that's interesting all by itself, too. So, one, it's the School of Law and Criminology there, and two, the Irish have somebody expert enough to offer opinions on U.S. constitutional law, and that's good because, the United States law looms large internationally in business and foreign affairs, so it makes sense for others to study, even though that means we're a little bit ethnocentric here. So I don't know whether he's American and has an innate understanding that he has just chosen to share with Irish students, or he's Irish and just is a American law prodigy for some reason and has figured it all out. But I'm trying to imagine all this being done in an Irish accent, and it's difficult to do. Anyway, the events of January 6th are casting a long shadow. Of course, voters in North Carolina are seeking to bar Representative Madison Cawthorn from running for re-election to his House seat, and those in Georgia trying to do the same with Marjorie Trader Greene. These voters have filed complaints with state elections officials, arguing that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that is to say, we'll set it up here again, filed complaints with state officials that their candidacies violate the federal Constitution. So you already see things setting up here. And that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment of the federal Constitution disqualifies members of Congress who engage in insurrection from appearing on the congressional ballot. Challenges to other elected officials and candidates have also begun, they note parenthetically, but these challenges face an intractable problem. As they see it, only the federal government, not the states, can disqualify insurrectionists from congressional ballots. Their view is states cannot unilaterally create procedures unless authorized by federal statute, which I'm sure they think the Constitution counts, to keep accused insurrectionists off the congressional ballot. If these members of Congress engaged in an insurrection, and I guess you could still say it's an especially if you're one of the people that say, I'm waiting for an actual conviction on insurrection charges. But if these members of Congress engaged in an insurrection, then the U.S. House of Representatives may exclude them, or federal prosecutors may charge them with the federal crime of insurrection. But in light of an important 1869 judicial decision, the cases against Mr. Cawthorn and Ms. Greene, which are currently mired in both state and federal proceedings, cannot remove the candidates from the congressional ballot. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 in the wake of the Civil War. Section 3 disqualified many former Confederates from holding certain public offices if they had taken an oath to support the U.S. Constitution, but subsequently, as Section 3 declares, engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Since 1868, the federal judiciary has had few occasions to interpret Section 3. As a result, the courts are largely in uncharted territory. Nevertheless, there is some important on-point precedent. An 1869 case concerning Hugh W. Sheffey, Sheffey, is instructive for the January 6th litigation and how courts might see things today. Mr. Sheffey took an oath to support the Constitution, but later served as a member of the Confederate Virginia legislature, thereby actively supporting the Confederacy. That's interesting too, but you should take note of the fact how he participated in the insurrection, because remember that Marjorie Trader Greene's claim is that all of this is ridiculous because she disavowed violence, and she says, I've always disavowed violence, and I said that we should be doing things peacefully, and that's very much open to question. but that's her claim. But it's possible that even taking her claim at face value doesn't absolve her of guilt, the guilt of insurrection, of participating in insurrection. It's nowhere, I don't know, I haven't read the trial history here or any of the background information on Hugh Sheffley, but what is his act here? He serves in the Confederate Virginia legislature, the Commonwealth of Virginia, what we would call the state legislature, but then get yelled at by everybody who loves reminding us that it's a Commonwealth for some reason instead of state. But all he did was serve in elected office. He also didn't participate in any violence, and he may or may not have. I mean, you might argue, well, he couldn't have disavowed violence if he were a member of the Virginia state legislature. He was implicitly endorsing the secession, and secession was enforced by force of arms, so therefore, but it's very indirect. And I guess it's possible that he was the one pacifist member, or hey, for that matter, one of several pacifist members of the Confederate Virginia legislature. We just don't know. I'm sure we could find out the facts, but at any rate, the point is that he seems to be very much removed from direct participation in any violence. Therefore, we might also conclude, depending on the outcome of his case here, I guess, that her plea is to have rejected violence as a concept, which though they're not true, might also not be helpful in exonerating her. So, 1869 case concerning Hugh Sheffley here. After the war, he served as a state court judge. As Judge Sheffley, he presided over the trial and conviction of Caesar Griffin for shooting with an intent to kill. Later, Mr. Griffin, this is very clever, challenged his conviction in federal court. He argued that Section 3 should have disqualified Mr. Sheffley from serving as judge. Griffin's case, as it is known, was heard on appeal by the Federal Circuit Court in Virginia. Salmon P. Chase, the Chief Justice of the United States and an appointee of President Abraham Lincoln, presided over the appeal. Chief Justice Chase ruled against Mr. Griffin, finding that Section 3 did not disqualify Judge Sheffley despite the fact that he had taken an oath to support the U.S. Constitution, and that it was admitted, as the case stated, that he later committed a Section 3 disqualifying offense, that is, serving in the Virginia Confederate legislature. It doesn't say what oath or where he took the oath, or why he took the oath prior to joining the Confederate Virginia legislature, though. I don't know in what context. It could have been the pre-Civil War Virginia legislature that he had served in, and likewise swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and, I guess, the Constitution of Virginia. But anyway, we'll take it as granted that he did so. Chief Justice Chase reasoned that legislation by Congress is necessary to give effect to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and that only Congress can enact that legislation. Chief Justice Chase added that the exclusion of disqualified officeholders can only be provided for by Congress. Congress must create the procedure that would determine if a defendant violated Section 3. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment emphasizes this principle. Congress, it states, shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. In short, Griffin's case teaches that in legal terms, Section 3 is not self-executing. An important point. We've talked about self-executing on the show before and what that means. That is, Congress must establish, or at least authorize, delegate, as a term I might use here, a holdover, something we bring over from the discussion of the independent state legislature theory previously. Congress must establish, or at least authorize, the process that affords accused insurrectionists an opportunity to contest the allegations brought against them. Mr. Cawthorn and Ms. Green deny that they engaged in insurrection and oppose any assertion that they violated the law, which would include Section 3 disqualifying offenses. Moreover, in the Cawthorn and Green cases, the plaintiffs have not pointed to any federal legislation authorizing the states to police Section 3 by disqualifying accused insurrectionists from the congressional ballot. Without federal authorization, state elections boards and even state courts could very well be powerless to make determinations about congressional candidates and Section 3. Now, there may be another way, based on existing statute, to disqualify a candidate from congressional ballots, the Insurrection Act of 1862. This legislation, which predated the 14th Amendment, mirrors one of the disqualifying offenses established in Section 3. The modern Insurrection Act is virtually unchanged from the statute Lincoln signed in 1862. If the Justice Department indicts and succeeds in convicting Cawthorn, Green, or others of insurrection under that act, then on that basis, state elections boards and state courts may remove these candidates from the congressional ballot. But so far, the Justice Department has not charged any congressional candidates with inciting or engaging in an insurrection or with any other disqualifying offenses. I think that's true, but it might be the case that people that they have charged might run for Congress nonetheless. That would be an interesting situation. Anyway, most of the January 6th federal charges have been based on things like property crimes or for obstructing official proceedings or assaulting officers rather than insurrection, even though we have had some sedition charges brought, right? If the Justice Department does not secure a conviction of a Section 3 disqualifying offense before the state ballot is printed, the primary in North Carolina is scheduled for May 17th and the one in Georgia for May 24th, then generally state boards of election and even some state courts will be powerless to remove otherwise eligible congressional candidates from the ballot. Though that's not what is claimed in Georgia. The claim is that the Georgia administrative law judge, working in conjunction with the Georgia Secretary of State, could order the voiding of all votes cast for Marjorie Taylor Greene. Whether that would hold or not would be open to question. Recently, some scholars and advocates have contested Chief Justice Chase's opinion in Mr. Griffin's case as precluding the state challenges against Cawthorn and Green. In their view, even in the absence of a federal statute, state election officials who conclude that a person engaged in an insurrection may proceed to remove that candidate from the congressional ballot. There is no Supreme Court precedent that squarely forecloses that position. Moreover, Chief Justice Chase's decision was not rendered by the United States Supreme Court, and so it's not controlling precedent. Remember here, if that's confusing to you, Chief Justice at that point, and all the justices were circuit riders. They participated in the proceedings of the circuit courts below, as well as sitting as a Supreme Court. So he was at the time Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but he wrote this opinion acting as a sitting member of whatever circuit court it was that was considering Griffin's case, not as Supreme Court Justice or Chief Justice Chase. So it's a little bit confusing, but I think that's what they're getting at here. So that's how it is that you could have an opinion in the case by Chief Justice Chase without having a Supreme Court precedent established by that opinion. Moreover, Chief Justice Chase's decision was not rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm sorry, I just read that one. So it's not controlling precedent. On Monday, a federal court in Georgia allowed the state court disqualification proceeding to go forward against Green. The federal judge did so without citing or distinguishing Griffin's case. So that's interesting too. I don't think I even took note of that one yet. On this Monday, I guess, a federal court in Georgia allowed the state court disqualification proceeding to go forward. Or is this before they sat for that proceeding? Yeah, so this was April 20th. So that would have been last Monday. And all right, okay, so it was Green suing in federal court to block the state administrative law proceeding that we watched last Friday from going forward. But she lost, and the federal court said, you can go ahead, and so they did. All right, where do we leave off here? I'm not sure why. Let's see. Where did we leave off here? Oh, scrolled too far up to get the date here. Okay. Jumping back down here. All right. The federal judge did so without citing or distinguishing Griffin's case. Still, we think the Chief Justice's opinion is persuasive. We expect state and federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, will likely follow this historically entrenched position. Chief Justice Chase's approach is the simplest path. There is no need for state election officials to decide far more politically charged questions about whether Cawthorn and Green, and potentially, looking ahead to 2024, Donald Trump, engaged in insurrection. Congress has not authorized the states to enforce Section 3 by striking congressional candidates from the ballot. Thus, state courts and elections boards lack jurisdiction to exclude alleged insurrectionists from the congressional ballot. In such circumstances, state governments must let the people decide who will represent them in Congress. And that's certainly part of the argument that Green's lawyer was making last Friday when that proceeding was underway, saying the only remedy really is to allow the election to go forward with them on the ballot and then leave it to Congress to decide whether or not they would expel these members or preclude them from taking the oath in their new term. That's a cramped view of it, but that's the argument that they were making. Now, Lawrence Tribe was tweeting this piece around and wrote this observation in just one brief tweet here. This argument is admittedly not based on controlling precedent or constitutional text. That is, it was a decision of a circuit court and not the Supreme Court. Although I don't know what circuit it was, and I guess if it was the circuit that includes either Georgia or North Carolina, I guess you could say it is controlling precedent, but I don't know. In fact, Tribe says it conflicts with the Elections Clause, whose text gives states power in the first instance to prescribe how a district's representatives are chosen. That's interesting too, right? So that's not exactly the same thing, but it does point out a real potential problem or hypocrisy to the extent that that matters to Republicans, which is that though they might want to latch on to this opinion piece because it would, if correct, protect two Republican members from challenges to their eligibility for the ballot. At the same time, in order to say that only the federal government can make this choice, you run into the problem of the independent state legislature theory, right? That the state legislatures have wide-ranging ability, plenary authority to make decisions like this. You could say, well, the authority in deciding how presidential elections will be conducted within the state is plenary to them, and they have the ability to do that, and no one has the right to stand in their way. But it might be different for other federal elections where the Electoral College doesn't come into play. I mean, the theory, I guess, could be that state legislatures have plenary authority in deciding how electors will be selected, but they don't have the same authority in deciding how to conduct elections for Congress, which are direct elections. It's possible, though I'm not certain on what basis they would make that assertion, but you could certainly make it. But if the theory is that state legislatures have plenary authority to determine how elections of all sorts are held in their states and by what methods, then you're not going to be able to also rely. Well, I mean, I guess you could plead in the alternative. We do have that. People who aren't lawyers always find that confusing. You could say, well, my contention is that state legislative authority is plenary with respect to all elections being held within the state, federal, state, or otherwise. And in the alternative, should the court determine that that is not the case, we would still argue that, well, we believe it's the case, perhaps it's only the case, and perhaps the court might agree that it's only the case with respect to presidential elections or elections to select electors for president, and not necessarily the case for everything else, including congressional elections. Now, of course, the court could disagree with all of that, but you can plead it in the alternative. But it is a little bit difficult to square if you're saying at the outset, well, it's my opinion that they have plenary authority over all elections, and then you lose on that question, or you, even if you win on that question, and then the court says, well, okay, how is it that the lack of authority over congressional elections suddenly saves your guys here? That states don't have the right to determine how congressional elections will be conducted within their borders, and that only the federal authorities can have that. Why is it that that's different for presidential elections? And if the only answer is the Electoral College, I'm not sure how strongly that stands up. Okay, that's pretty wacky, pretty deep, lots to think about there in that one. Okay, other things now I'm sure will occupy our attention. Getting close to another break. We'll have to decide what we might be able to cram in all of this. How about this? Just because it's relatively short, our Twitter friend, That Guy, who tweets as That Guy 3002, you have to have all the numbers, but it's easier to refer to him as That Guy, just points out, I guess now it's becoming perhaps a little bit more obvious that the Elon Musk purchase of Twitter might not actually go all the way through to fruition. A lot of fruit involved in today's case, fruition and ripe fruit as well. He tweeted yesterday, along with this Guardian article, I'll be curious to see if this is Musk's way to try to get out of this deal. Remember, I guess, for one thing, apparently he offered to pay too much, a real premium on each share, that he may never have been serious, or might just have been serious but want to get out of it now on second thought, and he might be engineering a way out of it. I'll be curious to see if this is Musk's way to try to get out of this deal. The agreement between him and Twitter specifically prohibits him from disparaging Twitter. Yet, I guess everybody is watching his tweets very carefully, and so you must have noticed that he's spent a considerable amount of time doing just that. And when not doing that, just basically trolling everybody else, like with his strange cartoon about how the left is really the ones that moved, and the right has stayed the same, and something. We all know that's ridiculous. But, the Guardian reports on this. Controversy growing after Musk engages with tweets criticizing Twitter staff. The acquisition agreement allows Musk to tweet about the deal, but not to disparage the firm or its representatives, and I guess that's what he's doing. Dan Milmo reports this for The Guardian. Controversy grew on Wednesday over tweets from Elon Musk engaging with criticism of Twitter employees, despite a promise from the entrepreneur not to disparage the company or its representatives while he completes the deal to acquire the social media platform. The world's richest man, true now, agreed to restrictions on his tweets as part of a 95-page agreement covering his $44 billion acquisition filed on Tuesday. However, a day after signing the agreement, which was published on the website of the U.S. Securities Regulator, the SEC, Musk responded to tweets from two political commentators that criticized Twitter staff. Musk replied on Tuesday night to a Twitter post from the podcast host Saagar, Saagar, Enjeti, flagging an article claiming Twitter's legal head, Vijaya Gandhi, I'm maybe mangling the name, had become, quote, emotional. Oh no. During a meeting to discuss the deal. In the post, Enjeti referred to Gandhi as Twitter's top censorship advocate in reference to the company's decision in 2020 to block sharing of a New York Post story about President Joe Biden's son, Hunter. It's all very complex here, but essentially they're talking about, I guess, the top attorney. Whoops, we're a little bit late on our music here, but the top Twitter lawyer for a number of things, but I guess everything, and her having to walk the tightrope to try to help guide content moderation policy at Twitter, and well, anyway, with him trying to claim that he was buying it in order to liberate free speech, he naturally took to attacking her when he may need her around after all. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Because we'll all be talking about Elon Musk all weekend anyway, I guess it is important to make it all the way through and try and figure out exactly what this controversy is all about and what potential it has, intentionally or otherwise, to blow up the deal. But as we were saying before we left, the podcaster, I guess, is what they're calling him. I mean, I'm a podcast host too, so what the hell? Saagar Enjeti. It's Saagar. It's his first name, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. Enjeti, Enjeti. Right, so it began with Musk replying to a Twitter post from Enjeti, flagging an article claiming Twitter's legal head, Vijaya Gandhi, Vijaya, and last name Gadde, had become emotional during a meeting to discuss the deal. And in the post, Enjeti referred to Gandhi as Twitter's top censorship advocate, which may or not be accurate, in a reference to the company's decision in 2020 to block sharing of a New York Post story about Hunter Biden, right? Okay, let's see. Musk replied, suspending the Twitter account of a major news organization for publishing a truthful story was obviously incredibly inappropriate. I'm not certain that anybody understands anything in this exchange, but okay. His intervention triggered negative tweets from users about Gandhi, including one quote tweet in response stating that she would, quote, go down in history as an appalling person, which isn't a very, not very convincing argument, but okay. But anyway, other posts called for her to lose her job. Musk also replied to a potentially defamatory tweet from the right-wing commentator Mike Cernovich about Twitter's deputy general counsel, Jim Baker, which referred to Baker's work in a previous role at the FBI. Replying, Musk wrote, sounds pretty bad. I don't remember what exactly the allegation was, but if it was from Mike Cernovich, you can be pretty sure it wasn't necessarily delivered straight. But okay. And there's a number of reasons to be concerned about this, not just because of the agreement supposedly in place about non-disparagement, but also it's of some considerable interest that the legal team that would be representing the current Twitter administration in any transfer of ownership agreement is being systematically attacked by the person who's attempting to buy the company. So the people who are responsible for, one, providing zealous representation to the current Twitter administration in administering this sale, and two, have a fiduciary duty both to the current board and I guess also to some extent by extension to shareholders, the people who are most capable of protecting the interests of shareholders in the current Twitter administration in working out a fair market transaction for the transfer of ownership are being systematically pushed out from the scene. They could be fired from their jobs in response to overwhelming negative public sentiment of some sort, or some sense that it's somehow unfair to have them involved in the transaction. And I guess I would liken it to the divorce law trick of advising a client, for instance, or a prospective client who might be coming to you looking for representation in a divorce in, say, a particularly small town or small environment where the top divorce attorneys, the kind of people that you wouldn't want on the other side working against you in a case, the advice is often given, why don't you go meet with every one of the top divorce attorneys in town about potentially representing you, and you'll have an initial meeting and you'll discuss details of the case. And then when you decide on who to hire, even if you obviously you're only going to hire, well, probably only going to hire one of them, but the fact that you had confidential consultations with the others precludes them ethically from representing your spouse in the divorce proceedings. A conflict of interest. They already know too much that has been revealed to them in confidence, and although they've never been engaged as your attorney, they are nonetheless ethically bound to keep the information you shared with them in confidence, even though you didn't end up hiring them. And it's a way of using the code of legal ethics to make it impossible for your spouse to find top quality representation in the divorce. Of course, they can go outside and have people admitted for special purposes of representing them, particularly if you're going to make some allegation that you did exactly this, then in all likelihood there's really no reason to exclude outside or counsel from outside the jurisdiction anyway. But if there ever was any, this would probably help override it. But anyway, it's frequently discussed in legal ethics classes. But what if what's going on here is systematically trying to remove from the case anybody who has enough intimate knowledge and understanding of the way the company is running and has been run, that they might be able to either defeat you in your bid to purchase the place, or engineer it such that you're stuck with some onerous terms in approaching the sale or after the sale or whatever. But if you're afraid that these particular lawyers can, make things difficult for you, and you seek to eliminate them from the picture this way, that could be troublesome if anybody can put that argument together. Anyway, former Twitter CEO Dick Costolo responded to Musk's comments on Twitter on Wednesday, calling out the CEO for bringing on harassment and threats to Gaddy. Costolo added, "Bullying is not leadership." Twitter CEO Parag Agrawal, another name I'm surely mangling, tweeted shortly after, "I took this job to change Twitter for the better, course correct where we need to, and strengthen the service. Proud of our people who continue to do the work with focus and urgency despite the noise," trying to protect the lawyers who are under attack. Twitter has been approached for comment, but I guess they didn't give any, Eleazar Klein, not Ezra Klein, but Eleazar Klein. It's the biblical twin here. A partner at a U.S. law firm, Schulte, Roth, and Zabel, said Musk's tweets would not have come as a surprise to the company despite the agreement. He said, the fact that he would be vocal about his beliefs cannot come as a surprise to the company or be unanticipated. You would imagine that the company will be thoughtful about what is really an issue in this case for the deal moving forward. The agreement also stated Musk would have to pay Twitter $1 billion if he walks away from the deal. The break clause, a common feature of takeover agreements, would be triggered if the financing for the deal falls apart. Twitter will also have to pay $1 billion fee to the entrepreneur if, for instance, it accepts a higher bid from elsewhere. So others have pointed out that for Elon Musk, it, quote, only costs $1 billion for him to just say, screw it, so I don't really care. It could be that he's disparaging Twitter employees in an effort to get out of the thing without having to pay the $1 billion. Or it could be that he ends up having to pay the $1 billion anyway. But if you're resigned to paying the $1 billion, you might as well just do that and be done with it. So it's of some interest, I guess. There's more to the article here. Musk has put together a $46.5 billion funding package for the deal, and his own contribution to it has concerned investors in Tesla, who wiped $126 billion off the company's value on Tuesday amid worries that the billionaire may have to sell shares in the electric car maker to fund his share of the purchase of Twitter, that is. Musk is part funding the Twitter deal with $21 billion of his own equity and a further $12.5 billion loan secured against his Tesla stake. The document filed with the U.S. financial watchdog also addresses Musk's penchant for attention-grabbing tweets that are avidly consumed and retweeted by his 86 million followers. The agreement states, the equity investor shall be permitted to issue tweets about the merger or the transactions contemplated hereby so long as such tweets do not disparage the company or any of its representatives. According to the U.S. dictionary publisher Merriam-Webster, we're back to the dictionary, the legal definition of disparagement is the publication of false and injurious statements that are derogatory of another person's property, business, or product. Hours later, Musk tweeted that Truth Social, Donald Trump's rival social media platform, was outperforming Twitter and TikTok on the Apple Store. Also on Wednesday, a U.S. district judge denied Musk's request to scrap a settlement with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission over 2018 tweets in which the CEO claimed he had funding to take Tesla private. That settlement required Musk's tweets regarding Tesla to be approved by a company attorney. The judge also denied a motion to nullify subpoenas in an investigation into whether Musk violated the settlement last November. So he's got a bit of a habit in this. And so I guess don't hold your breath necessarily if you're waiting for whatever reason for the acquisition to go through. Any number of things could still trip it up, intentional or otherwise. All right, let's see. Other stories to share with you in the last couple of minutes of the show. There are many. And which ones I'll do, I don't know. I shared with you yesterday just briefly a mention of the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene is at war with at least elements of the Catholic Church. I shared with Scott the link to the story about that in The Hill. But just to give you, you know what? I don't even know whether I really know what's going on here exactly. But at some point in, her typical craziness, Marjorie Taylor Greene here has decided to, I don't know, maybe the best thing to do is to zip through this article just to get some sense, to give myself some sense of what's actually going on here. A conservative Catholic organization responded to comments that Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene made about the church last week, calling her a disgrace. So we're already on step 2 here. What we're reading about, just by way of getting the background, is it's Catholic, I forget who this is, the Catholic League. Bill Donahue, who is a bit of a loony guy as it is, and a vocal defender of the Catholic Church on all sorts of fronts, but a very conservative guy, is responding to her comments, and I think she's responded in kind as well. But I don't know how or why the exchange started. It didn't start between Marjorie Greene and Bill Donahue. It was just Marjorie Greene saying things about the Catholic Church. Donahue injects himself into it by way of defending the Catholic Church and says she's terrible. And she has since said, oh yeah, well, you're terrible. So, or explained why she thinks they're both terrible. So that's the point at which we're on in the timeline when we're reading this article. In an interview with Catholic Militant last week, Greene said that recent efforts by Christian organizations and churches to help resettle undocumented immigrants and refugees in the United States, like core mission, really. But she says they're evidence of Satan controlling the church. The church is not doing its job. You know how she speaks. Not doing its job. And that's actually a more northern accent, but it's not doing its job. There we go. And it's not adhering to the teachings of Christ, Greene said in the interview, which sets up, of course, the accusation that you're accusing, you're saying that you're more Catholic than the Pope. In other words, criticizing the Catholic Church for exercising Catholic charity in the name of Catholic Charities, the organization itself, and helping to resettle refugees of all kinds, which is, I guess, in her mind, a controversial thing to do because she thinks that all refugees are invaders, and that would make the church a fifth columnist in helping invaders take over the United States. But that's just because she has a crazy and mistaken belief about immigration and migration in general. But, we could debate that elsewhere. So essentially, yeah, are you saying you're more Catholic than the Pope? And her answer is, yes, I am. That is what I'm saying. And we'll see whether she explains herself adequately in the excerpts captured in this article. The church is not doing its job. It's not adhering to the teachings of Christ. The president of the Catholic League, or rather the full length of it, the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, Bill Donahue, responded to the Georgia Congresswoman's comments in a statement Wednesday saying that while Greene had plenty of opportunities to make rational criticisms of Christian organizations assisting refugees, see, he is conservative, he will allow for that, she instead slandered the entire Catholic Church. Satan is controlling the Catholic Church. She needs to apologize to Catholics immediately. She is a disgrace, Donahue said in the statement. Donahue also said that the Catholic League is contacting House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy about the incident, warning that he has a loose cannon on his hands. Greene responded to Donahue's remarks with her own statement Wednesday, explaining how she actually is more Catholic than the Pope, I guess, writing that she was referring to church leadership and not the Catholic Church as a whole with her comments about Satan. But she goes on to say, I refuse to use kinder, gentler language as Bill Donahue might prefer. Stuck in the 80s like Trump. Kinder, gentler, right? When I talk about his disgusting and corrupt friends who have made him rich with the donations from ordinary church-going Catholics, Greene wrote. Greene, whose controversial online comments have been constant during her time in Congress, was pressed in a tense hearing last week over whether her posts leading up to January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol helped spur the day's events. That's sort of a non sequitur. And there's not much more in this, but I'll see if I can find the tweets where she, from Marjorie Trader Greene, where she's explaining herself. She's basically saying that she was born into a Catholic family and was raised Catholic, but left the church. And she presents an interesting argument here, in which she's not wrong, which is a hard thing to say about Marjorie Trader Greene. But she's basically saying her claim is that she left the church because she felt that her children were not safe in it because of all of the child predator priests in the Catholic Church and how they just get reassigned. Oh, it's just like a valid concern and everything. Now, whether or not she ever experienced anything like that, or whether she really believed that her kids would, in fact, if raised in the Catholic Church, fall victim to such predators. I don't know. I think it might have more to do with her being, well, down in Georgia, it's not that they have no Catholics, but prevailing sentiment among the political conservatives, where she needs her, where she finds her base, is that Pentecostal evangelicism, I guess, is really the place where it's at, and the way you prove that you're a true believer. So it might be for political reasons that she needed to abandon the Catholic Church and become, a Protestant evangelical instead. But of course, it also squares. I mean, it's a great explanation for why you left the Catholic Church. Would be not only would you put yourself in agreement and alignment with evangelical voters, but also with QAnon voters. If you said that your real objection to the Catholic Church was the predatory behavior against children. So I think it's just taking double advantage there. That might have been her genuine belief, but her genuine belief are in many cases in things that don't exist. But at least with respect to the fact that there is some problem inside the Catholic Church and that they haven't dealt with it properly, she's actually right. And it's weird because it lends credence to the rest of her stupid claims, which don't have any. So it's a very interesting situation to see between them. And I wish them both luck in destroying each other, I suppose. There's nothing else for it. But anyway, I just thought I would put that one on the record. There's more, of course, in other stories, and I guess one that really should be brought to your attention before we leave for the day. And then, let's see, one short one that I think, well, that goes in the general file. I guess warning for the weekend is what I'll bring you, this one here. And I think somebody must have tipped me off to this one in my KITM hashtag somewhere at some point, and maybe it was something else. Could have been through email or something, but now I can't bring it to mind. But I'll bring the story up anyway from MSN.com, the not MSNBC but MSN network is where this was published. Andrew Feinberg, the writer on this. Oh, and it looks like maybe it's picked up by MSN via The Independent, where Andrew Feinberg would be writing. Top Trump officials intervened to give $700 million in national security, quote-unquote, national security loans to a trucking company. So a developing possible scandal here for the old administration, but a current story. Senior Trump administration officials, including then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, intervened to push Treasury Department officials to approve an emergency coronavirus relief loan to a trucking company on national security grounds, despite career officials' objections. A new report from the House Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis has found. Not the Select Committee we are hearing an awful lot about these days, but they are still working. According to the report, which was prepared by Select Committee staff, Trump administration political appointees flagrantly disregarded, that's a quote, a Defense Department assessment that a trucking company called Yellow Trucking was not, quote, critical to national security, and therefore ineligible for a loan under a program authorized for such companies under the 2020 Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, CARES. You remember that one. Despite the objections of career Pentagon officials, the administration authorized a $700 million loan, an amount which used up 95% of the funds appropriated for the program, and did so under generous terms, which violated CARES Act requirements, because who cares? There's no such thing as law. Evidence obtained by the Select Committee suggests that these decisions were driven by the White House and President Trump himself, the report said. So now we got to find out who is Yellow Trucking and what were they doing. Were they the company that Mnuchin hired to help clear the gold bars out of Fort Knox and abscond with them? I don't know. We don't really know that he did that. I'm just asking questions. It would be irresponsible not to. Evidence obtained by the Select Subcommittee suggests that these decisions were driven by the White House and President Trump himself. Specifically, the committee found Meadows intervened after multiple communications with lobbyists representing Yellow, along with other White House officials who regularly communicated with the company. I don't find that at all surprising. I guess what the surprising part is that they had the audacity to ask for 95% of the funds authorized for such loans, all for themselves, and then they got it. The committee also found that then Defense Secretary Mark Esper received briefing materials which stressed that Mr. Trump had received a call advocating for the loan. After the Treasury Department approved the loan, Mr. Mnuchin immediately emailed Mr. Meadows the announcement and highlighted praise for President Trump in news reports about it. The Select Committee also said it obtained documents which show Mnuchin reached out to Esper after Pentagon staff told the Treasury Department it would not be certifying Yellow as a critical to national security recipient here by having his office arrange a phone call with Mr. Esper and the two cabinet secretaries' top lawyers. The report found that Trump administration records showed that the two men had previously discussed the political aspect of Yellow's certification process. Following that phone call, Mr. Esper overruled career officials to certify Yellow as critical, the report said. From news to politics. I'm sorry, this is a pitch here for joining and subscribing to The Independent is what comes next. We've reached the end of the article. So not a lot of detail yet, but something worth watching, and perhaps things will develop over the weekend, although I expect it'll be next week before we finally just forget the whole thing and it gets memory hold. But definitely some interesting questions to be asked by investigators there. That's an awful large chunk of the full amount authorized, 95% to one company, and nobody in the Pentagon. What does the Pentagon really know about national security, though? Nobody in the Pentagon agreed that there was any real connection to national security. But what the hell? Why not give them 95% of the money? That's pretty amazing. All right, let's see. Anything else that we might be able to sneak in? We'd need a very short item. And perhaps it can be this one. Just not a major story, but just like, oh my God, groaner. A tweet from Steve Vladek from just the other day. When was it? April 27th, so Wednesday. Saying, okay, kids, just pointing out more media bias, I guess, with a screen grab from Axios. And he says, okay, kids, let's see if you can spot the difference between the two judicial, quote, flourishes that Axios equates. With a hat tip here to Jameson Foster, who I guess originally found it. The screen grab reads thus. Again, a report from Axios saying Judge Kyle Duncan, 47, also serving on the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, willfully misgendered a trans woman. That's the problem here. Duncan refused to revise her name on court documents on technical grounds, and in a 10-page ruling, he argued that if a court agrees to use her instead of the pronoun him, then it would be wading into a sea of, quote, neologisms, inventing new words, in other words, including more complex pronouns like, and I don't even know if these are in use or people have made these up or what, her, spelled H-I-R, and I guess Z is supposed to be something like, I guess, Z-E instead of S-H-E, like they did with changing Miss to Ms., right? Maybe Z, her, and I don't know why you would have to change the spelling of H-E-R, but I don't know. There's some etymology behind it, I'm sure. But this is what's more interesting. So that's kind of annoying and offensive stuff, right, from a conservative judge refusing to acknowledge somebody's identity, and we understand why they feel like that's a power flex to do. So, bad thing. Axios then goes on to say, but, you know how they do things, right? But, colon, that's in bold. Judges appointed by Democrats aren't immune to rhetorical flourishes. For instance, they offer, newly confirmed Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, right? Well, she did so in a U.S. District Court ruling that Trump's former White House counsel Don McGahn must comply with the congressional subpoena. How has she engaged in a rhetorical flourish? Presidents, she wrote, are not kings. That's literally it. That is the rhetorical flourish. It is a rhetorical flourish, that's true. But of course, I mean, you see what Axios has done here. They've said, well, all rhetorical flourishes are created equal because after all, they are all rhetorical flourishes. And one side engages in them just as the others did. One says presidents are not kings, which of course A is true. Now, they would argue that what Duncan said is true, too. It isn't, but that's the argument. But A, it's true, but B, it's a direct quote from a rhetorical flourish that's very frequently used in cases seeking to circumscribe presidential power. They remind us that they're not kings, and it's not absolute authority that they hold, but they hold authority pursuant to law. It's just like saying this is a nation of laws, not men. That's a rhetorical flourish, but it means something. Whereas saying, I am angry about transgender individuals, and I refuse to acknowledge that they have any sort of point whatsoever, and I refuse to refer to people the way they wish to be referred to. That's a little bit more than a rhetorical flourish, for one thing. But even if it was just a flourish, not the same kind as stating a legal truism. Well, everybody knows that. Anyway, quite annoying. Axios. Bad Axios. Stop doing it.
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, now it's time to listen to West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy in the Morning with Justice Putnam, because he comes up next. What's he got in tap for you? Let's see. Ron DeSantis, of course, still waging his all-out war on Florida residents' civil rights. And let's see, 16 states suing the U.S. Postal Service. Let's find out what that's about next.